Hello, everybody. I'm Gwen Campbell Mindus. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. This title, A Matter of Magic, this is an omnibus two-book edition of the duology that I am about to do commentaries about in this episode and the next one. And this particular cover, this particular thing, actually gave me a heart attack because, you see, I had read Merlin the Magician and the Magician's Ward. I own them as a omnibus duology. And under this cover, which is my actual well-worn dust jacket of the hardcover book, which is in my hand at this moment, under Magic and Malice. And the thing is, I saw that, and for a very long, heart-stopping moment, I thought that I had missed a third book in this series that had been published since. And then I get a closer look at it, and I realize they've just published these two books in an omnibus edition twice under different titles, which I find amusing and possibly perplexing. Anyhow, so given that this is, in fact, two books in one thing, I don't own individual copies, but I looked up on the internet some covers, so I have individual covers, one for Merlin the Magician and the other for the subsequent book, Magician's Ward. So this is Patricia C. Wrede, who, as you may have guessed from the fact that I have done many of her books thus far, is a favorite of mine. And this first book, Merlin the Magician, published in 91 initially, this takes place in a universe that oddly feels very much like the Sorcery in Cecilia Enchanted Chocolate Pot trilogy. Both of these take place in approximately Regency England, about the time that Jane Austen is writing. They're taking place approximately around the Napoleonic Wars, and both of them are in universes where magic is real, shockingly. And the odd thing is they don't take place in the same universe. They sound, at first blush, as though they should, but they don't actually. And the big keynote, aside from the fact that Magic and Malice is co-authored with Carolyn Stevermer, but the big keynote difference actually is in a fundamental of the practice of magic in Merlin the Magician as compared to the other books. And that is a thing to do with the practice of magic that actually doesn't come up until the second book, but it is the thing that tells you these are in different realities, although if you dismiss that and sort of shove it aside, you can, pretend that they exist in the same way, and if there were more fan fiction on these, there would probably be a lot of crossovers, but in any event, the big keynote difference between them is that in Merlin the Magician, for whatever conceptual reason, Patricia Wrede decided that a spell cannot be cast in the native language of the caster, meaning if you are an English speaker, a native English speaker, you cannot cast magic in English. If you are a native French speaker, you can't cast the magic in French. And so all of the spells have to be cast in a non-native language. Whereas if you read Sorcery in Cecilia, there is a scene in which Thomas's mother, the Lady Sylvia, in fact casts a spell by just stating very firmly, your hair will stay up, it will stay up all evening. And she does it by, force of will and possibly some arcane gestures, but the point is, she doesn't cast a spell, she just uses she just speaks to sort of force the magic into what she wants it to do. Whereas in Merlin the Magician, all the spells have to be cast in non-English, that Merlin, partway through this first book, casts a spell that is very much a stopgap off the top of his head, throwing things together, and it still has to not be in English. Now, that, of course, doesn't actually tell you what's going on here. In this particular pair of books, our narrator, and this is, the omniscient third-person single-perspective narration, but the protagonist and, in practical terms, narrator of these books is a young lady named Kim, who was born on the streets and was raised to be a thief, to be a housebreaker, and our book opens with her not entirely certain of how old she is, but she knows that she's old enough that she's not going to be able to keep pretending to be a boy anymore very long, because she has been pretending to be a boy. She is, at first, if you're young enough, a girl can pretend to be a boy very, very easily, but she's getting to the point where she will start to develop female assets such that she will possibly not be able to pretend that any longer, and pretending to be an adult man with a light woman's voice may be a problem. So she's actually at a very, very problematic point, because she needs to find a way off the streets lest she get forced into becoming a prostitute, and she doesn't have any domestic skills, not that she'd want to enter domestic service. And so this book opens with her basically doing a job for a man where she's not stealing anything. She has just been employed to break into the man's wagon and find out what he has in it, and then report back for £5. Now, £5 doesn't sound like very much, but we always have to remember that when you scale up costs, when you consider, how much more money was worth in the past, £5 is a fortune. And indeed, when she talks about Merlin the Magician, who we find out during the course of this book is actually Richard Merrill, who is the son of some minor lower level nobility, that his family has £40,000 in the fund, which is enough to make them genuinely independently wealthy. Whereas these days, £40,000, if you go over to England and you say £40,000, that's a year's salary or wages for a regular schlub who's not making all that much money. But back then, that is the equivalent of being like millionaires. Billionaires, really. That they are exceedingly wealthy. Now, but what you have is she's doing this job for the £5, which she is hoping to parlay into getting her somewhere else, getting her some kind of job, getting her into a position where she can not worry about being forced into prostitution, about being forced to work for the main antagonist, the villain of this book, or one of the two villains of this book, I suppose, Dan Laverum, who is a kind of Godfather-like figure who organizes crime, maybe more Moriarty-like. He's basically, he runs all the crime in, like, a huge percentage of crime in the city. He's at the center of various webs. And so she knows Dan Laverum, and she doesn't want to wind up under his control. And then, during the course of the break-in, She gets knocked out by a spell on a chest that she has opened that is in Merlin the Magician's possession, and he, instead of giving her over to the Bow Street Runners, i.e. the police, he instead invites her along. And he promises to teach her to read and teach her stagecraft, which she immediately decides this could be her way off the streets, because if she's able to be a professional magician, if she can learn how to do that, like a stagecraft magician, not like a person with real magic, then she can use that and work her way into show business, which is at least a job that's not on the streets. And so she goes with him, and they have various adventures because he is trying to prove his innocence of a theft that happened several years before. And at the end of this book, he winds up asking her to become his apprentice, to teach her real magic, because it turns out that she is able to do real magic. And I really, really enjoy these books. I have managed to talk my way through a whole bunch of stuff without actually talking about what I love about these books, which is, among other things, that they are funny and serious at the same time. There is a wonderful bit. There are two periods of effectively farce in this book. The first time when Kim and Merlin are stuck in a secret room, a priest's hole, and watch a whole parade of people go by, including the leader of a bunch of local so-called druids who decides to stand on a bucket and threaten people with a gun, and is acting ridiculous and melodramatic, asking for this sacred dish, which is described as somebody that you can hear him putting capital letters on the word. And the whole scene is ridiculous, especially when he falls off his bucket by the window. And then the very end of that book has a similar scene where Kim and Merlin have been taken captive by Dan Laverum and brought aside to find the last of this Saltash set that Merlin is trying to prove he didn't steal, and bring them along to the Druids' headquarters. And along the way, the so-called head Druid tries his hand at hijacking the carriage, and so they bring him along, and then they get there and they find the witless Freddie and Marianne, who are thinking of eloping, and then they get taken hostage, and then another character shows up because he's trying to figure out what happened with them, and then more people show up because they were chasing after Marianne, and the whole thing just spirals out of control, and it is genuinely hilarious. And also very, very nice is the way that she sets up Kim, the discovery that Kim understands magic, because you have time after time where she talks about how the words are lining up and she can see them or feel them or what have you. And when she gets to the end of this and we discover that Kim's ability to see the magic and understand it and all this stuff is not due to the magic, it's due to Kim. That Kim's ability to pay attention and to see what Merlin is doing when he casts his spells is fundamental to her native talent to become a magician. And the book ends with a wonderful little exciting line that leads you into the next book, which is that she's looking forward to this. She's looking forward to being his ward, because interesting wouldn't be the half of it. After this, anything might happen. Anything at all. And that leads us into the next book, which, because I'm basically out of my 15-minute limit, That's everything, and we'll talk about the next book next week.